thank you so much for the opportunity to visit. It's been a great day. I've seen so many good papers on private debt, on private data, cryptocurrencies, momentum factors, other exciting things. So I've learned a lot today. Very much my privilege to be here. And likewise, I've really enjoyed working with David and Massim, both with whom I got to know from working at FAU. Massim is our former PhD student who's now close by in Houston, but he's got too much teaching currently to be able to come over today, but he sends his regrets. David is, busy with family and other things on Valentine's Day, which I hope we can go and enjoy soon if I don't take too much of your time. Okay, so my job today is to do two things. I want to talk to you a little bit about a paper to get you excited that politics and corporate finance is like a fun topic. So if I encourage you that you should look more into this topic, then I've done my job. And then the second thing I want to do is encourage you to consider a special issue of a journal being edited by some great folks here that's on this topic of politics and corporate finance. So two things I want to do before we go out drinking later tonight. So let's get started. So there's a lot of talk about politically connected firms in the news, and this is timely in a variety of senses. So one sense is that once we had this COVID scare, there was lots of concern over who got this government money, who got these contracts, what they were, being billed, and other things, and so that's very popular news-wise. Secondly, it's not just in the U.S. So if we go over across the pond to the UK, you see a fun example about the worst liquidation in the UK. And what's up with this firm? Well, it had 450 contracts, 450 contracts, and, talking billions of debt, and all of this went into the toilet, causing massive jobs loss, so 43,000 jobs, 27,000 pensioners affected, and then it has other implications for the supply chain, about 30,000 suppliers. And as someone who made the mistake, there are any PhD students in the room, so I made the mistake, I'm Canadian, sorry, couldn't help it, born there. I made the mistake of, I thought, well, I'm Canadian, I'll work on Canadian data. And it turns out nobody cares about Canada. It's very hard to publish papers with Canadian data. So I learned quickly that I should use international data, like either US data or, why not get many countries? And so that's what I've been doing for the better part of the last 25 years or so, is trying to get international data, because as it turns out, if you see one result in one country, there's no reason to necessarily expect it's going to hold in another country. My original topic was venture capital and private equity, and the example there is that contracts are done way differently depending on which country you're in. So it's very hard to come up with theories that explain optimal contracting when, tax systems and other things so vastly influence how things are done from one place to the next. So this topic area is no different, and nobody's really done this in an international setting. There are single country studies, but not international studies. So that's why we wanted to look. And why did, in the international context, in our case, we have 27 countries. And the things that we can examine include these institutional conditions, cultural, the foreigner issue, military connections, which are super important in the government contracting space. And then we can even address issues about whether government contracting is good or bad with respect to firm valuation, and even capital allocation efficiency. So we can address those questions as well. And we're going to see that those answers are different depending on the country. And there's, tons of papers, single country studies, but lots of great contributions here, lots of things that you can read up on. And the literature is getting, more crowded, but there's certainly space. The space that we're going to tell you about is this international context, a very big important role for, military and foreign firms. So those have particular importance for getting contract awards. And then the political connections, super important depending on whether or not you're foreign or not. That'll very much help you. You might be wondering, how do I measure political connections? So you have to have worked in the government before. So you're former government employee. That for us, that's going to mean a politically connected firm. Right, and then on these valuation effects, if I put you to sleep, hopefully I won't, I'll keep it short and sweet here. The valuation effects, we show that it's going to increase in weak institutional environments, getting these deals. So if you're in a super bad country in terms of legal institutions, then that's going to be helpful for you. But if you're in a good country, well-developed economy, these contracts are actually bad on average. It's not helping things, if you will, due to all these lobbying and other things that are associated with these contracts. And then the other thing that we're going to show is that it's worse. The contracting process makes things worse for allocative efficiency. So that's especially true for local contractors in developed countries. So there's lots of room for improvement, in other words, in this marketplace. And so things that many papers can work on in the future to design better processes. Okay, so I don't want to overkill you with a lengthy presentation and our 10 million slides, but I will tell you just a little bit why you get excited about this. So with the political connections, what they do is that it can improve information flow. So there's an information channel. There's a element of trust and group thinking, so a social network channel, as well as a human capital transfer, or a knowledge channel that allows us to believe pretty unambiguously that political connections are going to enable government contracts. These things should be stronger in the context of lowering information asymmetries, lowering the power of government bodies to allocate resources through these social network channels and these less complicated government contracting procedures. And so this association with political connectedness and contracting should be weaker in better institutional environments. That's the first thing that's going to be new that we'll look at in the paper. Cronyism is obviously important in this context. Favoritism, cronyism. So those things we indeed expect to be relevant in our context, and using Hofstede measures, we can proxy for those elements. And then finally, with our foreign firms, you can assess things like information asymmetries, bureaucratic barriers, and being foreign, basically, it's going to make it that much more important with respect to government contracting. And particularly in the case of military personnel, that becomes especially important in this international context. So that's what we think is going to go in the data. And, nobody's collected these data before. So a few years ago, we looked at Massim, and, we have to, give PhD students something to do, right? So he said, get the data, you do this or die, basically, right? And so Massim's an awesome guy, very smart guy. He got the data, and he's an absolute rock star with respect to data, working with data, writing papers, everything. I'm sort of like window dressing, I guess you could say. Massim, a very great guy, as is David. So I very much benefit working with them. So we got data from 27 countries, 2009 through 17. Where do you get the data? So this is helpful. Earlier today, by the way, I attended a great session on private data. I learned a lot about new sources to go examine, and this is, an increasingly common thing, right? Because if you're just doing another paper with CRISPR CompuStat, everybody's done those papers. So to be new and innovative, look for new data sources. So hopefully this gives you some ideas that you can go to this TED data set, Tender Electronics Daily. There's an historical Australian government contract data set. There's even an Open Data Canada portal if you really want to go to Canada. And So we have various ways of merging the data. That's always tough, but we do our best to merge it with our usual suspects. You also can make use of Bordex. That's a popular one these days if you haven't examined those. So in the end, what do we have is 270,000 contracts, 61,000 firm year observations. So it's a pretty big data set. And the measures I told you, we look at whether or not you've been employed by the government before, and if you're military before. In an international context, that could be a little bit different because you could have been employed by a different country's government before. So you have those as well, and then we can even count how many employees are in that context. And you know, when I was a PhD student, I hated doing this. Like, you know, cutting the data means medians. My supervisor said, do it. And I'm like, well, I don't want to do that. I just want to run the regression, get my 3 stars, and then go have beers, right? You know, but it turns out that this is the best way, I think, as I get older and more cynical, because if you want a regression result, I can absolutely find you a regression that will give you the result. So it's nicer to look at the raw statistics to see what's going on in the data. And so at least it buys you a lot of confidence. So the politically connected firms on your right-hand side, they get, you know, larger contracts no matter how you measure it. Like absolute value, divide by sales, common thing to do. You don't want to divide by income because you can manipulate income. Sales are a little hard to lie about. You know, if it's part of a competitive process, we could do this on contract level sample, a firm level sample, or propensity score match level. All of those things show up in the data. So really quickly, because this is a tough time to go through too many slides and statistics and the like, but I'll just tell you that we have base results that absolutely tell us that, yes, if you're politically connected, you're much more likely to get a contract. And so in this international context, you might go, well, what's the economic significance? And it's 31% more likely on just a simple, you know, regression that doesn't have fancy endogeneity controls or other things. So that's, you know, not just statistically significant, it's economically large. And you do the same thing on the firm level data set. That too exists. The economic significance is 6% more. So it's still economically significant and apparent at the firm level as well. Now, if you're wanting a toolkit for endogeneity, I'll tell you without going through all of the details that we're able to do 4 things. So one is dynamic tests, because it could be the case that a contract last year leads to another contract this year, and you know, maybe you have those sort of dynamic problems going on. So what you do, you use lag-dependent variables. You might have an autocorrelated structure, that type of stuff. So of course, run through those checks. There's good precedent papers to use to do that. The second one is that people die, you know, like the death literature, right? And we always like it when people die because it's a new control for exogeneity, right? You know, maybe you didn't expect them to die and now you're less connected, right? So we can use that in 2 ways. One is just to look at changes in political connection. That's item 2. And then the item number 3 is to run what's known as a stacked difference in differences. And there's a good source for this, where you create cohorts of people that might die around, say, 65 and stuff, and you stack it with the cohorts and do that over a window of a few years, and then run a difference in differences in that way to see if your findings are robust. Now, the 4th one is a good selling point for international data. So we always like regulatory changes, but regulatory changes can be endogenous, because if you're in a really crappy country, they might change the rules in response to the bad market. Now, in our case, we are lucky because we have a European Union directive that changed the rules. And so that's helpful because, you know, it's dictated by Belgium. So just because I have a great new friend from Spain, which I love, I got to spend a couple months in Barcelona last year, and then I saw the Valletta de España finish in Madrid and everything. Love Spain, you know. I got a good Spanish joke later, I got to tell you. So if you're in a country like Spain, you know, they might have changed the rules because things are going wrong in Spain, but no, you can't argue that. The rule change is dictated by Belgium, so it's arguably very exogenous. And so I've gotten away with selling that story a few times for European Union directives. So if you do use international data, that's a great way to say the regulatory change is quite an exogenous event. So those are the checks that we run through and find that they all work. And if you want my slides, I'm happy to show them to you. But I don't want to take your Friday afternoon when you could be with your husband or wife or dog, whoever you spend your Valentine's Day with. I just tell you those are the ones that we did, and it's all statistically significant effects. The next set of tests that we do are in respect of legal conditions, and so these political connections on government contracts, they're strong in countries with bad legal conditions, much stronger, and that shows up really pronounced. There's various ways using, you know, the World Bank measures, the Laporta et al. Measures for that, you know, whole cottage industry doing those, but that shows up super pronounced. You know, might be someone who likes these cultural conditions, measuring cronyism, proxying it in our case by the Hofstede indices. So you can run through all of them, and we do. We find that those are all quite important in the data as well. Now, I'm not going to bore you with all the details, but they are very large, those effects. And then the contractor foreignness, it matters a lot. So if you have someone that's foreign, you know, it's a big impact. So here we show almost 30% increase in government contract value for the local firms, and then a 54% increase in the government contract value for foreign firms. So much different in terms of how that works. So being foreign is quite a big difference between the two. You know, put differently, you know, local people know you, and then if you're from foreign, then why should I deal with you? Oh yeah, I used to work with you. So that works out well for them. Now I'll tell you a little bit about the value implications before stopping on the project. Here, well-developed countries, these contracts that are awarded on average don't help value, which is kind of surprising. It's not what you'd expect immediately. And we divided this by the upper median in terms of their GDP, the countries, and then consider the local versus the foreign as well. So if you're in a less developed country, they're value enhancing, a well-developed country, value destroying. And then finally, for foreign contractors, those are all value enhancing. And we think that there's good reasons to see that in terms of these binding effects and other possible things that help the access to foreign government resources. On the efficiency side, the last thing that I'll tell you about is that the contracts worsen efficiency. We measure this in two ways. Number one, the sensitivity of Q to new investment, and then secondly, cash to new investment. So the first one, you want it to be sensitive. The second one, you don't. And you see that the contracts are very much associated with the association with Q going down and the association with cash going up. In other words, they worsen investment efficiency. Okay, so that's our story. We have this new data, international data. Hopefully, we encourage you that international data is good. Hopefully, we encourage you there's some fun, you know, crazy, scandalous stuff that go on, especially with the Canadians moving to Florida. Those are the really bad people. And there's lots of scope for papers here. We've just sort of touched the surface on things that we think are going on in the data, but there's way more details that you could use. Also, there's, you know, these days, merging different data sets together, there's lots of ways where these data could be merged with other things that could be used to create new papers. And I always, you know, love working with new people, meeting good folks. So if you want to chat about these things later, very happy to discuss ideas.